I don't know why we agreed to do it. Maybe it was boredom, or maybe it was the thrill of doing something we weren't supposed to. Either way, that's how we ended up standing in front of the rusted, padlocked gates of the old Bellamy Brothers Circus on a cold Saturday night. The place had been shut down for nearly 2 decades. No one knew exactly why. There were rumors, fires, deaths, a missing performer, but nothing concrete. The only thing people agreed on was that you didn't go there. It's just an old circus, Masson had said earlier that evening, trying to sound nonchalant. It's not haunted. It's just a bunch of rotting tents and junk. Elliot, our so-called fearless leader, had grinned. Then let's prove it. And so, here we were. The air smelled damp, like old wood and rusting metal. The entrance booth, once painted in bright reds and yellows, was now peeling and sagging under years of neglect. Beyond the gates, I could see the remains of the big top, its canvas sagging like the skin of something long dead. The wind whistled through the torn fabric, making it shift and ripple as if it was breathing. Lena hesitated. This is a bad idea. I agreed with her. But Elliot was already climbing over the gate, and Mason wasn't far behind. That left Lena and me. Come on, I muttered, more to convince myself than her. Let's get this over with. I climbed over the rusted bars, my fingers scraping against the metal, and dropped down on the other side. The ground was soft, almost marshy. Lena followed, sighing as her boots sank slightly into the mud. We had no idea what we were walking into. Once we were inside, everything felt wrong. The silence was the first thing I noticed. No distant city noise, no crickets, no rustling leaves. Just the occasional creak of the wind tugging at the old circus structures. It was like the place had swallowed up all sound. Elliot led the way with his flashlight, sweeping it across the empty carnival stands and broken rides. A carousel stood in the middle of what used to be the main square, its once vibrant horses frozen in time, their glass eyes reflecting the light in an eerie, lifeless way. Look at this, Mason said, picking up a weathered circus flyer from the ground. It was damp and yellowed, but the faces of the performers were still visible, smiling trapeze artists, a bearded woman, and a clown with hollow eyes. The name at the bottom sent a chill down my spine. Bellamy Brothers Circus, one night only. The show you'll never forget. That's weird, Lena murmured, frowning. There's no date on it. Elliot shrugged. Probably just a promotional thing. But his voice didn't sound as confident as before. We moved past the square and into the main performance tent. The big top was even more unsettling up close, ripped fabric, wooden bleachers covered in dust, and the scent of mildew heavy in the air. The center ring was still there, with a few rusting props scattered around. A toppled unicycle, a balancing beam, and an old clown costume, draped over a wooden box like someone had left it there in a hurry. Jesus, Mason muttered. This place is a graveyard. Lena shivered. It feels like everyone just left in the middle of a show. She wasn't wrong. There were half-melted candles near the center stage. A cracked popcorn bucket on the floor. As if the performers had been interrupted and never came back. But the worst part was still ahead of us. Over there, Elliot said, pointing toward a dressing room on the far side of the tent. Its door was slightly open, revealing a glimpse of something shiny inside. I didn't want to go in. But we did. And that's when we saw the mirror. The dressing room smelled of stale grease paint and something sickly sweet, like rotting wood mixed with faded perfume. Dust clung to every surface, coating the cracked vanity tables and scattered costume pieces. The air felt thick, as if the room was holding its breath. But none of that was what made my stomach clench. It was the mirror. It stood in the center of the room, framed in gold, its surface too clean for a place abandoned for decades. The glass should have been coated in dust, but instead, it gleamed, so pristine it almost seemed to glow in the dim light. And there were fingerprints on it. Fresh ones. Someone had touched this mirror recently. Maybe this morning. Maybe an hour ago. What the hell? Mason whispered, stepping closer. He raised his hand, hesitating for a second before pressing his palm against the glass. A perfect copy of his print appeared in the reflection. "Who else would have been here?" Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elliot swallowed. "Squatters, maybe?" I wasn't so sure. Squatters would have left other signs, sleeping bags, trash, food wrappers. But this place was empty, except for the perfectly preserved mess left behind from whatever final performance had taken place here. Lena's breath hitched. "Look at the floor." We all did. A trail of footprints led to the mirror, but there were none leading away. I felt my heart start to race. Maybe they got cleaned up somehow. A thud echoed from somewhere deeper in the circus. We all froze. It had come from outside the dressing room. From the main tent. Someone else was here. And they were moving. The four of us stood motionless, barely breathing. The thud had come from outside, somewhere near the center ring of the circus tent. It wasn't the sound of something falling, it was deliberate. Like a footstep. Elliot was the first to move. He clicked off his flashlight, plunging us into near darkness. A sliver of moonlight seeped through the torn canvas of the tent, barely enough to see by. "Shh," he whispered. We listened. At first, there was nothing. Just silence thick enough to choke on. Then, another sound. Soft. Scraping. Closer. Lena grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my jacket. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. "Who's there?" Mason called out, his voice tense. He was trying to sound brave, but I could hear the edge of fear in it. No answer. Elliot motioned for us to move, keeping low. We crept toward the dressing room door, inching it open. The main tent stretched out before us, its gaping darkness swallowing everything past a few feet. Something moved near the carousel. I couldn't see it. But I could hear it, the shuffle of fabric, the creak of old wood under shifting weight. My skin crawled. Lena whispered, "We need to leave." "Now." Elliot nodded, but his eyes stayed locked on the carousel. Then, just as I was about to turn toward the exit, the carousel started moving. It groaned to life with a metallic screech, the gears grinding after years of rust and decay. The faded horses began to turn, their chipped hooves rising and falling with slow, jerky movements. And the worst part? There was no one on it. At least, no one we could see. The carousel groaned as it spun, its rusted gears shrieking against time. The chipped, hollow-eyed horses bobbed up and down in a slow, jerky rhythm, like something mechanical struggling to come back to life. None of us moved. None of us breathed. This was wrong. "That shouldn't be possible," Lena whispered. "There's no power here. No generators. Maybe it's battery-powered?" Mason offered weakly, but even he didn't believe it. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The carousel lurched, its movement ceasing with a heavy clang of metal. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. And that's when I saw him. Standing just beyond the carousel, half hidden in the shadows of the tent, was a man. He wore a red circus coat, the kind ringmasters used to wear, with gold embroidery running down the sleeves. His face was hard to make out in the dim light, but something about his posture sent a deep, primal warning through my bones. He was watching us. "Do you see that?" I whispered, my throat dry. Elliot followed my gaze and stiffened. "Who the hell is that?" The man didn't move. He just stood there, still as a mannequin. Then, he tilted his head. The way he did it made my skin crawl, like he was studying us. Calculating. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked away, disappearing behind the carousel. We waited. Listened. Nothing. Mason swallowed hard. "We need to get the fuck out of here." No one argued. But when we turned to leave, the main entrance was no longer open. The chain on the gates we climbed over? It was locked. I knew we had left the gate open. We had climbed over it easily, there was no chain, no padlock. But now, as we stood frozen at the entrance of the tent, the rusted metal bars loomed in front of us, and the gate was shut tight. A thick, new-looking chain was wrapped around it, secured with a heavy padlock. "What the fuck?" Mason whispered. He ran up to it, yanking hard. The chain rattled but held firm. Lena spun around, searching the dark. "That man. He locked us in." "But how?" Elliot muttered. "We were watching the carousel the whole time. No one walked past us." I didn't have an answer. The night suddenly felt colder, pressing in around us. My skin prickled with the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Mason cursed under his breath and tried climbing, but the bars were slick with moisture, and the spikes at the top made it nearly impossible. "We have to find another way out," Elliot said, his voice tight. "There has to be a break in the fence somewhere." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to think. The circus was big, bigger than just the main tent. There were trailers, backstage areas, and probably an old maintenance exit somewhere. "Back entrance," I said. "If we find where the performers used to come in, maybe we can get out that way." Elliot nodded. "Let's move. And stay together." As we turned back toward the heart of the circus, a sudden gust of wind rushed through the tent, making the old fabric billow and ripple like something breathing. Somewhere behind us, the carousel creaked again. Moving. Even though no one was there. We didn't stop. We headed deeper into the circus. We moved fast, sticking close together, as we left the main tent behind. The deeper we went into the circus grounds, the more it felt like we were walking backward in time, like we had stepped into a world that had been abandoned mid-breath, waiting for someone to press play again. Dust-covered stalls lined the path, their peeling signs advertising cotton candy and strongman challenges. Old circus wagons stood forgotten, their doors slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of moldy costumes and rusted props. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt thicker. The silence deeper. And the shadows? They felt too dark, stretching longer than they should under the weak moonlight. "This way," Elliot whispered, leading us toward a low building tucked behind the tents. It was small, with faded letters above the doorway that read, "Performers only." The wooden door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a long, narrow hallway lined with dressing rooms. The air inside was stagnant, thick with the scent of old wood and something sour, like decaying fabric. We stepped inside. The floor was littered with forgotten things, a cracked makeup case, a pair of dusty ballet slippers, a single red clown nose lying in the middle of the hallway, like someone had just dropped it. Lena shuddered. "I hate this place." Elliot ignored her and pushed forward, trying the doors as we passed. Most were locked. Some were slightly open, revealing glimpses of mirrors, broken chairs, and costumes still hanging in place, as if the performers had stepped away and never returned. And then Mason stopped. He was staring at something near the end of the hallway. "What?" I asked, but when I followed his gaze, I felt my stomach drop. A door stood slightly ajar, and on the inside of it, someone had written, "Don't look in the mirror." The ink had bled into the wood, like someone had carved the words over and over again in a panic. The door was open just enough to see a sliver of glass reflecting the hallway. And in that glass, there was a shape standing behind us. A sharp, icy terror gripped my spine. The mirror inside the dressing room reflected the narrow hallway behind us, but something was wrong. There were 5 of us in the reflection. But there were only 4 of us standing there. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. My breath hitched as I took in the extra figure. A man stood in the reflection, motionless, just behind Mason. He was tall, his body draped in a dark, tattered coat, his face hidden beneath shadow. But what made my skin crawl was the way his head was tilted, ever so slightly. Like he was watching us. Studying us. And then, he moved. Not in real life. Only in the mirror. His hand twitched, and his head snapped toward me so suddenly that my legs almost buckled. I spun around, my chest tight, my lungs screaming for air. Nothing. There was no one behind us. But when I turned back to the mirror, the figure was closer. His head was now inches from Mason's shoulder, his mouth twisted into something that looked almost like a grin. "Get away from the door," I whispered, barely able to form words. Mason hesitated, still staring. "What are you?" "Move!" I grabbed his arm and yanked him back just as the mirror's surface shuddered, like ripples spreading across water. Lena slammed the dressing room door shut, cutting off the reflection. Silence. None of us spoke. None of us moved. Mason was breathing hard. "What the fuck was that?" Elliot exhaled shakily. "I don't know. But we're not staying to find out." Lena's hand trembled as she pointed down the hall. "The back exit." "Now." No one argued. We left the mirror behind. But something told me it didn't leave us. We didn't speak as we moved deeper into the hallway. No one wanted to be the first to admit what we'd all seen. Mason kept glancing over his shoulder, his face pale. Lena wouldn't look back at all. The back exit had to be close. It had to be. Elliot led the way, his flashlight beam jittering as his hand shook. The hallway seemed longer than before, stretching ahead like a tunnel. The air was growing heavier, pressing in around us. Then we saw it. A rusted metal door at the end of the hall, a faded sign above it. Exit. Relief flooded through me. We could leave. Elliot lunged forward, grabbing the handle. He twisted. It didn't budge. He tried again, yanking harder. The door rattled, but it held firm. Locked. "You've got to be kidding me," Mason growled. He shoved past Elliot and threw his full weight against it. The door didn't even creak. "It doesn't make sense," Lena whispered, her voice unsteady. "Why would they lock an exit from the inside?" A terrible thought wormed its way into my mind. Maybe, I swallowed. Maybe they weren't trying to keep people out. Maybe they were trying to keep something else in. A sharp tap sounded behind us. We all went rigid. Tap, like knuckles rapping against glass. Slowly, I turned my head. Halfway down the hallway, the dressing room door, the one with the mirror, was open again. But we had closed it. I could see the sliver of glass inside. And in the reflection, the man in the red coat was standing in the hallway now. Not in the mirror. In real life. And he was facing us. For a moment, none of us moved. The man in the red coat stood in the hallway, perfectly still. His face was wrong, too smooth, as if it had been wiped clean of features. No eyes, no mouth. Just skin where a face should have been. But the worst part? He was standing in the exact same position we had seen him in the mirror. Like the reflection had stepped out. Lena let out a strangled noise, barely holding back a scream. Elliot reacted first, grabbing Mason and shoving him toward the exit. "Find something. Break the lock." Mason scrambled, his hands shaking as he yanked at a rusted toolbox sitting against the wall. He grabbed a crowbar and started hacking at the door handle. I couldn't move. Because the man in the red coat had tilted his head, slowly, deliberately. And then, he started walking toward us. His footsteps were soundless, his movements eerily smooth, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. I felt ice spreading through my veins. "Lena," I whispered, grabbing her arm. "We have to move." She was staring, frozen, her breathing shallow. And then, the lights flickered. Just once. A brief, shuddering pulse. And when they came back on, he was closer. Too close. He wasn't walking. He was blinking forward every time the lights dimmed, covering impossible distances in a fraction of a second. A breath shuddered out of me. "Mason. I'm trying," Mason shouted, slamming the crowbar against the rusted door handle. One more. The lights went out completely. And in the pitch-black darkness, we heard a voice. Too close to my ear. "You shouldn't have looked." The lights flashed back on. And he was right in front of me. I stumbled back, my throat locking in a silent scream. The man in the red coat was inches from my face. His head twitched, his faceless skin stretching like something was beneath it, trying to push through. My chest tightened as a whisper crawled into my ear, though his mouth didn't exist. "You let me out," I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Then, crash! The door handle snapped off as Mason smashed it loose with the crowbar. The heavy metal door swung open, slamming against the wall. Go! Elliot bellowed, grabbing me and shoving me through the exit. I barely registered my feet hitting the ground outside. Cold night air flooded my lungs, but my legs almost gave out beneath me. Lena and Mason stumbled out next. Elliot was last, slamming the door shut behind him. Then, silence. Only the sound of our ragged breathing filled the night. We had made it out. But my stomach twisted as I stared at the door. Something wasn't right. Mason turned to me, his face pale. What the hell was that thing? I couldn't answer. My pulse was hammering so loud it felt like my skull was vibrating. Elliot ran a shaky hand through his hair. We need to go. Now. Before. Lena made a strangled noise. We all turned. She was staring at me, eyes wide, her face draining of color. Her hand lifted, pointing at the metal door's surface. Slowly, I turned to look. And that's when I saw it. The door was reflective. And in its surface, I wasn't standing with the rest of them. I was still inside the building. My breath hitched in my throat. The metal door's surface was scratched and warped, but there was no mistaking what I saw. In the reflection, I was still inside the hallway. Standing just beyond the threshold, my face pale, my eyes wide with horror. But I was here outside. I could feel the cold air, my own heartbeat hammering in my chest. This didn't make sense. Mason took a step back. What the fuck? Elliot grabbed my arm hard. Say something. I blinked at him. What? Lena's hand covered her mouth, her eyes darting between me and my reflection. This isn't possible. I turned back to the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. The other me, the one in the reflection, was starting to move. But not like me. Not at the same time. A lag. A hesitation. As if it wasn't copying me, but deciding how to act. Then my reflection smiled. I wasn't smiling. A slow, curling grin stretched across its face, too wide, too forced. Like it was trying to convince them it was me. Lena choked on a breath. Oh my God! And then, it raised its hand and knocked on the glass. Tap. The same sound we had heard inside. The sound we had thought was coming from the mirror in the dressing room. It wasn't. It had been coming from me. Or rather, the thing pretending to be me. A chill sank deep into my bones. Elliot whispered, "We need to go. Right now." But Mason wasn't looking at the door anymore. He was looking at me. And the way he was staring? Like he wasn't sure if I was the real one. Mason's stare felt like a blade against my skin. I could see it in his eyes, the hesitation, the flicker of uncertainty. Did he think I wasn't me? I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Mason, it's me." He didn't answer. His gaze darted back to the reflection, where the other me was still grinning. Its head tilted, slow and deliberate. Like it was waiting. Then, it raised a hand and waved. A small, slow wave. I felt sick. "Guys, we need to go," Elliot said, his voice tight with fear. He grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the door. "Right now." Lena nodded, but she still looked shaken. She kept glancing between me and the reflection, her hands trembling at her sides. Mason didn't move. "Mason," I said again, panic creeping into my voice. "Come on." His jaw clenched. "How do we know?" I froze. "What?" His fists curled at his sides. "How do we know you're the real one?" My heart stopped. Lena sucked in a sharp breath. "Mason, stop." "No." He shook his head, eyes wild. "That thing." He jabbed a finger at the door. "It's standing in there, but what if the real one got switched? What if the one out here isn't?" A deep, muffled laugh came from the door. Low. Amused. I felt a sickening wave of déjà vu. It was laughing at us. Because this is what it wanted. For them to doubt me. Mason, you saw me leave with you, I said, my voice urgent. I ran. I felt the cold air. You heard me breathing, talking. But what if we just think we did? His voice cracked. What if that thing already got out? The reflection of me raised a hand again. And pressed its palm against the glass. I saw its fingers twitch, subtle, controlled. And then I felt a sharp, burning pain in my own hand. I gasped and yanked it back. When I looked down, my palm was red, like something had been pressed against it from the inside. My stomach twisted. Lena saw it too. Her face strained of color. Oh my God! Elliot didn't wait. He grabbed me and pulled me away. We're leaving. Now. Mason hesitated, just for a second, before finally stepping back. His expression was still tight with doubt, but he moved. We ran, leaving the thing behind the door to watch us go. And as we sprinted away, I swear I heard it whisper. Are you sure you left the right one behind? We ran. As fast as we could. The circus loomed around us, the broken tents and rusted rides blurring past in the darkness. My lungs burned, but I didn't dare stop, not with the sound of Mason's breathing just behind me. Not with Elliot's grip tight on my wrist, pulling me forward. Lena was sobbing as she ran, her hands clutching at her chest like she was afraid her heart would burst. We reached the front gates. Still chained shut. But Mason didn't hesitate this time. He swung the crowbar and smashed the padlock off with a single, desperate strike. The metal clattered to the ground, and the chain unraveled. We scrambled over the gate one by one, gasping as we hit the pavement outside. Free. The circus sat behind us, dark and silent. The tents were just shadows against the sky, as if the whole place had been waiting for us to leave. I turned, my heart hammering. Nothing moved. No reflection in the distance. No man in the red coat. Just quiet. But then, Mason spoke. Is it over? I couldn't answer. Because something was wrong. The four of us stood in a tight, trembling circle, the night air thick with our ragged breathing. But as I looked at my friends, really looked at them, my stomach twisted. Something was missing. Or rather, someone. Lena. Mason. Elliot. Me. That was four. But when we entered the circus, there were 5 of us. Someone else had come in with us. I knew it. I could feel the empty space where they had been. But my mind was blank. No name, no face, just a deep, sickening certainty that there should have been one more person here. I opened my mouth to speak. But no one else looked confused. Mason wiped his face, sighing with relief. Let's just go home, okay? Lena nodded weakly. Elliot was already walking away. I stood frozen, my skin crawling. Because I suddenly realized. Maybe the circus hadn't let anything out. Maybe it had just taken something back. And none of us even remembered who.